Hello, today I'll explain how an electrolytic cell works. I suggest that you watch my previous reduction potential video to understand any mathematics behind the workings of this cell. The following video will consist of 3 parts. The first will describe the components of the electrolytic cell. The second part will explain why the electrolytic cell works. The third part of the video will explain why the anode and cathode have different charges. The times for each part are listed in the video description below. Alright, let's start with the first part, the components of an electrolytic cell. An electrolytic cell consists of 4 main components. First, it has the electrodes, which are made of the anode and the cathode. Second, it has a wire connecting the electrodes to the battery. Third, it has the solutions surrounding the electrodes. Fourth, it has a sole bridge, or the solutions themselves serving as a sole bridge. There is another drawing, as I will show you here, which has the solution itself serving as the sole bridge. Most of the times when you see an electrolytic cell, you would see it drawn this way. However, for the purposes of this video, I will draw the sole bridge because it is easier to analyze the electrolytic cell that way. Let's start with the electrodes. The anode in the electrolytic cell, just like in the galvanic cell, gets oxidized. You can memorize it with the simple word anox, anode, oxidized. The anode loses electrons, it loses these electrons, which flow into the cathode. The cathode itself gets reduced because it takes in electrons. Let's move on to the battery. The battery in the cell provides energy for the reaction to take place. Without the battery, the reaction would not take place, and I will explain it in the second part of the video. Let's move on to the solutions. The solutions themselves help to store various products and the reactants of the reaction. They function like the solutions in the galvanic cell, so watch the previous galvanic cell video to see how these solutions function. Lastly, there is the sole bridge, or the solutions themselves as shown in the previous drawing. The sole bridge essentially prevents charge buildups in the cell by providing the negative and the positive ions to neutralize the charge buildup in solutions. If, let's say, too many electrons go to one side and there are no positive ions there to counter the negative charge buildup, then the current will not be able to flow due to too many electrons being in one spot and repelling the additional incoming electrons. So if there are too many electrons down here and any additional electrons want to come over here, they will not be able to come through as easily because these negative electrons basically repel the incoming negative electrons. And then the current will not be able to flow. So the job of the sole bridge itself is to provide these positive charges, which will prevent this electron buildup because the positive charges neutralize the addition of the extra negative charge from the electrons. Alright, so these are basically the parts of the electrolytic cell which help it to function. Alright, let's move on to part 2. Here I will explain why the electrolytic cell works and the role of the battery. So in the electrolytic cell we have 2 electrodes. We have the anode and we have the cathode. The anode gets oxidized and the cathode gets reduced. Now, however, we must remember that the anode and cathode are usually made out of different substances. So the anode, for example, would be made out of one element and the cathode would be made out of a different element. Some substances have a greater tendency to get reduced or gain electrons, and other substances have a greater tendency to get oxidized or lose electrons. Normally, we will put the substance which tends to lose electrons at the anode and the substance which tends to gain electrons at the cathode. The electrons would then flow by themselves because one substance would tend to lose electrons and the other substance would tend to gain electrons in our cell. However, here is the catch. In the electrolytic cell, we switch these substances. We want the substance that tends to gain electrons and get reduced at the cathode to instead serve as the anode. And we want the substance that tends to lose electrons and get oxidized at the anode to instead be at the cathode. So basically, we want the substance that naturally tends to lose electrons to instead receive electrons and serve as the cathode in our electrolytic cell, and the substance that tends to gain electrons to instead lose electrons and to serve as the anode in the electrolytic cell. However, the substances have an opposite natural tendency, so we must force their reaction to occur. We must force a current from the substance that tends to gain electrons to the substance that tends to lose electrons. There must be energy added to the reaction to occur because it would not occur by itself. That is why we use a battery. The battery provides the right amount of voltage for the reaction to happen. It counters the tendency for the reaction not to happen. The reaction is not natural but artificial. So in this case, since this substance does not tend to lose electrons, we need the battery to pull the electrons out of it, to literally force it to lose its electrons. And for the substance that does not tend to accept electrons, we need the battery to push the electrons into it. So the battery provides the energy to pull the electrons out of the anode and to push the electrons into the cathode so that this current could flow and the reaction could happen. Now on to part 3. Here I will explain why in the electrolytic cell the anode has a positive charge and the cathode has a negative charge. I will provide an analogy to explain the charge difference, but in order to see it, we have to look at the whole reaction. In the reaction, as explained in part 2, the current is being unnaturally forced away from the anode and towards the cathode, instead of naturally going from anode to cathode. We also know that nature tends to resist changes and tends to counter them. Since the anode is unnaturally losing electrons, it tends to resist the change. The anode turns positive to resist the loss of electrons by attempting to attract them back, because positive attracts negative. A similar thing happens at the cathode. The cathode is unnaturally gaining electrons. It is basically having electrons pushed into it. So it acquires a negative charge to repel the incoming negative electrons, because negative repels negative. The whole reaction is not supposed to happen by itself. So a battery overcomes these changes in charge and these opposing tendencies to forcefully take electrons from the anode and forcefully push electrons into the cathode. However, the anode and cathode continue to unsuccessfully resist this change. Now that is my explanation of the electrolytic cell. See you next time.